My suitcase hit the hot concrete of the driveway, spilling my clothes across the lawn for the neighbors to see. My daughter-in-law sneered that they were tired of me, while my son refused to meet my eyes. They assumed a 67-year-old woman would just disappear quietly. But as I reached for my phone to text the most ruthless lawyer in Austin, I knew they had forgotten one crucial detail. My name was still on the deed to their house. My name is Eleanor Wade, and at 67 years old, I found myself standing on the baking concrete of a driveway in one of the most expensive suburbs outside Austin, Texas. The sun was relentless, high and bright, but the heat radiating from my cheeks was pure humiliation. My vintage leather suitcase, the one my late husband Frank bought me for our 20th anniversary, had just been shoved with such force that it toppled over the curb. The latch snapped open. My cardigans, my sensible cotton underwear, and my orthopedic socks spilled out onto the manicured St. Augustine grass like guts from a wound. Sienna stood at the top of the steps. She was wearing a matching yoga set that probably cost more than my entire monthly Social Security check. She crossed her arms, looking down at me not with anger, but with a terrifying exhaustion. "We are tired of you, Eleanor," she said, her voice flat and carrying easily in the quiet afternoon air. "The whole house is tired of you." Behind her stood Aaron, my son. The boy I had nursed through chickenpox and comforted through heartbroken teenage nights refused to even look at me. He stared at a spot on the stucco wall and mumbled, "Do not make this difficult for us, Mom." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was full of sand. I forced the words out, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "I paid for half the down payment on this house. Aaron, my name is on the deed. I am not a guest you can just kick out." Sienna laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt like a physical slap. "That was just a formality for the bank." "Eleanor," she said, waving a manicured hand as if shooing away a fly. "Everyone knows who actually pays the mortgage now. This is our house." I felt the weight of eyes on me. Across the street, Mrs. Gable was peering through her blinds. Two boys on bicycles had stopped at the corner, watching the drama unfold. This was the worst kind of shame. It was public. It was naked. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted iron, determined not to let a single tear fall while they were watching. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Aaron finally looked up, checking his watch nervously. "We have the investors from New York flying in for the dinner party tonight. Mom," he said, his tone urgent now. "We need to protect the brand image. We need the guest room for their coats and luggage. We cannot have you sitting there in your old armchair making things awkward. Just go to a motel for a few days. We will figure something out later." A few days. The way he said it sounded like forever. He was not asking for space. He was erasing me. I knelt on the hot pavement to gather my things. My hands were trembling as I stuffed my clothes back into the case. That was when I saw it. The silver frame holding the only photo I had of Frank and me from our honeymoon. It had been tossed separately, landing face down on the asphalt. I picked it up. The glass was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks obscuring Frank's smiling face. That cracked glass hurt more than the heat or the words. It was the final severance. They had not just thrown out my clothes, they had thrown out my history. The heavy garage door began to rumble down, sealing them inside their air-conditioned fortress and leaving me out in the sweltering heat. I did not bang on the door. I did not scream. I dragged my suitcase over to the edge of the flower bed and sat on the stone border to catch my breath. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached into my purse and pulled out my old smartphone. My thumb hovered over Aaron's name in my favorites list. My instinct, honed over 30 years of motherhood, was to call him and apologize, to ask what I could do to fix it. But then I looked at the cracked photo in my lap. I scrolled past Aaron. I scrolled all the way down to the C section, to a number I had transferred from phone to phone for 4 decades, but never once dialed. Colton Harrington. My fingers felt stiff as I typed. They just threw my bags out of the house with my name on the deed. I think it is time we talk. Colton. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. I stood up. The suitcase was heavy, but the sudden clarity in my mind made the load feel lighter. I smoothed down my skirt, gripped the handle, and began walking toward the main road. My shadow stretched out long and thin on the pavement. They thought they had discarded a burden. They did not realize they had just cut the only anchor keeping them safe. I was not going to be the silent mother in the corner anymore. For 35 years. I was a nurse in the emergency room of a county hospital in San Antonio. I know the metallic smell of blood, the chaotic rhythm of screaming sirens, and the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift that stretches into 14. I know what real life looks like when the skin is peeled back. I was never afraid of the grit, but I was terrified of the pristine, cold silence of the neighborhood where my son lived. It was a world where the grass was cut with laser precision and the people smiled without their eyes ever crinkling. After Frank died of a massive stroke right there on the oil-stained floor of his auto repair shop, I felt like half of my own body had turned to ash. We had been a team. He fixed the cars, and I fixed the people. When he was gone, I looked at the small savings we had scraped together and the value of his garage. It was everything we had. I sold it all. I handed a check for nearly $200,000 to Aaron so he could launch his boutique real estate marketing firm. I moved into the guest suite of the house that money helped buy, telling myself it was to avoid the crushing silence of widowhood. I told myself I was helping family. In the beginning, Sienna played the part well. She called me Mom and asked for my meatloaf recipe. We planted hydrangeas together. But as Aaron's company started landing accounts in the 7 figures, the warmth evaporated. It started with small comments. She would wrinkle her nose when I came home from a volunteer shift at the clinic, telling me I smelled like sickness and poor people. She told me my laugh was too loud, too country for their dinner parties. I remember the night of Aaron's big contract celebration at a rooftop bar downtown. The city lights were glittering below us like scattered diamonds. I had worn my best beige cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons. Sienna took one look at me and guided me to a table tucked away behind a row of oversized decorative palms, right next to the service station where the waiters dumped dirty dishes. She told me it was a cozy spot, but I knew the truth. She hid me. I sat there, nursing a glass of water, and watched Valerie Lowell, Sienna's mother, holding court in the center of the room. She was wearing silk that shimmered like oil on water. I heard her voice drift over the jazz music as she leaned in to whisper to a potential investor. "It is so hard to maintain a luxury brand image," she said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "When you have a mother-in-law who looks like she just wandered out of a dusty public library." I swallowed that insult. I swallowed it just like I swallowed the cold coffee in the ER break room. I told myself that as long as Aaron was successful, as long as my son was happy, My pride did not matter. But then Aaron started to change too. He began correcting my grammar at the breakfast table. He criticized the way I held my fork. When I tried to tell him about my day, he would cut me off, saying, "I am busy. Mum, please get to the point." I was living in a house full of people, yet I had never felt more invisible. The breaking point was not a scream, but a whisper. I was coming down the stairs one afternoon when I heard Sienna on the phone in the foyer. She was laughing, that icy, practiced laugh. "Look, if we did not need her cash for the down payment 5 years ago, we would have bought a different place entirely," she said. "But now she just wanders around like a ghost. She loves playing the victim." I stood frozen on the landing. I was not a mother to them. I was a capital investment that had finally fully depreciated. I thought about the nights I used to come home from the hospital, smelling of antiseptic and fatigue, and scoop Aaron up when he was a feverish toddler. I would rock him for hours, whispering that I would work until my hands fell off to make sure he had a good life. I promised him he would never have to struggle like Frank and I did. I kept that promise. I gave him everything. And in return, he looked at me with shame. I walked back up the stairs that day, my heart hardening in my chest. I realized then that I had made a mistake. I thought love was enough currency to buy respect. I was wrong. In their world, love meant nothing if it was not wearing a $3,000 suit. If they wanted to treat this family like a business transaction, then it was time I started acting like the majority shareholder. I pulled into the gravel lot of Big Ed's Diner off Highway 71. It was one of those places that time seemed to have forgotten, with checkered floors and a jukebox playing George Jones at a low volume. It felt like a sanctuary compared to the polished glass and steel of the world I had just been evicted from. I sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, watching the door. When Colton Harrington walked in, the air in the room seemed to shift. He was no longer the lanky boy with holes in his jeans who used to read poetry to me under the oak trees on campus. He was a man who commanded space. His hair was silver now, swept back, and his navy suit fit him in a way that whispered quiet, dangerous wealth. But his eyes were the same, storm grey. He did not scan the room. He walked straight to my booth, sliding into the seat opposite me without hesitation. "I knew it was you just by the way you hold your spoon." "Eleanor," he said softly. Seeing him felt like looking through a telescope into a life I almost lived. We had not spoken in over 40 years. Not since my mother forced me to break things off because she said a law student with no family name was a bad investment. She wanted stability. She wanted me to marry a man with a trade, like Frank. The irony was bitter on my tongue. I had spent my life doing exactly what I was told to secure a safe future. And here I was, homeless at 67, sitting across from the unstable Risk who had become one of the most powerful real estate attorneys in Texas. I did not have the energy for small talk. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out the crinkled brown envelope containing the copies of the paperwork I had saved. My hands were shaking, just a little. I slid them across the laminate table. Colton put on a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. The softness left his face. He uncapped a red pen and began to read. For 10 minutes. The only sound was the scratch of his pen and the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. His brow furrowed. He flipped a page, then flipped it back, circling a paragraph aggressively. "Eleanor," he said, looking up over the rim of his glasses. "Do you know what you actually signed 5 years ago?" I told him what Aaron had told me. It was just authorization for him to manage the property taxes and utilities, to simplify the paperwork since Frank was gone. Colton turned the document around and pointed to a line of text. You did not just authorize him to pay bills. You capitalized a new entity. Look here. Lowell Wade Development, LLC. I stared at the words. I had never heard that name before. He continued, his voice dropping to a low, professional register that sent a shiver down my spine. When you gave Aaron that check from the sale of the garage, and when you signed the deed transfer for the house, you were entered as a founding partner. 51% of the initial capital came from you. Technically, you are not just a resident they kicked out. You are the primary investor in their family business. My mouth fell open. I had thought I was a charity case living in their guest room. All this time, they were living on my foundation. Colton leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. And kicking you out, dumping your belongings on the lawn in the state of Texas, given your age and financial dependence on that housing, that is not just an eviction. That is civil grounds for a claim of elder abuse. If we wanted to, we could tear their reputation apart before dinner time. The words hit me like a physical blow. Elder abuse. It sounded so ugly. I thought of Aaron, my little boy who used to bring me dandelions. I felt a sudden surge of nausea, but right behind it, something else ignited. A spark. For years, I had felt small, useless. Now, looking at the red ink on the paper, I realized I held a weapon. I do not want to destroy him. Colton, I said, my voice steadying. I do not want Aaron in jail. I just want them to know I am not a piece of furniture they can toss out when they redecorate. Colton nodded slowly. He capped his pen and sat back. Then we do not go to war. Not yet. We send a letter. We inform them that the silent partner is speaking up. We demand a renegotiation of the terms of your living arrangement and your equity in the company. We scare them with the truth. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin was warm, grounding me in the reality of the moment. My mother told you the law was a game for scoundrels, Eleanor. But this time, we are going to let the law stand by you instead of against you. The neon sign of the motel flickered with a dying buzz as I pulled into the parking lot. It was one of those places on the edge of the highway where the sheets always smell faintly of stale smoke and the carpet feels damp. As I dragged my suitcase into the room, I looked at the peeling wallpaper and felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat. For years, working the night shift in the emergency room, I had treated elderly patients who had been dropped off and forgotten by their families. I used to hold their hands while they waited for rides that never came, and I would tell myself that at least my son was different. At least I had raised Aaron better than that. The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and dialed Daisy. She was my oldest friend, a widow living on the other side of town in a neighborhood that people like Sienna called rough, but I called home. I kept the details sparse, skipping the legal revelations Colton had uncovered, and just told her they had put me out. Daisy did not gasp. She did not offer empty pity. She just let out a long sigh and said, Eleanor, if you do not stand up for yourself this time, they are going to think you were put on this earth solely to take the blame for their mistakes. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. I dreamed I was back in the garage, the smell of grease and coffee filling the air. Frank was sitting in his old leather recliner, the one with the duct tape on the armrest. He looked at me with those sad, kind eyes and said, You saved hundreds of lives in that trauma center. L. You cannot save a child from his own cowardice, but you can still save yourself. I woke up with wet cheeks, the sound of his voice fading into the hum of the air conditioner. The next morning, my phone chimed. It was a text from Aaron. Mum, do not make a big deal out of this. We just need some space. Talk next week. I stared at the screen. Space. He called, throwing his mother out on the street space. He truly did not understand. He thought this was just another time I would absorb the hurt, fold myself smaller, and apologize for taking up room. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the dark circles under my eyes. I asked myself if fighting back made me a traitor. Was I betraying the family I had built? Then I remembered my mother. I remembered how she forced me to leave Colton 40 years ago because Frank was the safe choice, the stable choice. I realized I had spent my entire life making decisions based on what kept the family comfortable, sacrificing my own desires at the altar of their stability. And where had it gotten me? Here, alone in a cheap motel with a cracked picture frame. I met Colton again later that afternoon. This time, my hands were shaking less. I told him the truth. I told him I was terrified that if I sent that legal letter, I would lose Aaron forever. I was afraid my son would hate me. Colton looked at me, his expression unreadable, but his voice gentle. He said, Eleanor, if the only way you can keep a relationship is by letting them trample you, then that is not love. That is just hostages and captors. I went back to the room and stared at the wall for hours. I thought about the deed. I thought about the money I gave Aaron. I thought about Sienna's sneer. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the room in long, orange shadows, I picked up my phone. I typed the words before I could regret them. Send the letter. I will stand by it. An hour later, I checked out of the motel. I drove to Daisy's small, clutter-filled house. She welcomed me with a hug that smelled of cinnamon and laundry detergent. Her spare room was tiny, filled with boxes and an old sewing machine. But as I unpacked my clothes, I felt something I had not felt in the guest suite at Aaron's mansion. I felt welcome. I was no longer a parasite living in a host's body. I was Eleanor Wade, and for the first time in a long time, I was standing on my own 2 feet. Colton fired the first shot on a Tuesday morning. It was a formal demand letter sent directly to the legal counsel of Lowell Wade Development, outlining exactly what we had found. He listed the unauthorized capitalization of my personal funds, the failure to provide fiduciary notice, and the blatant violation of Texas property codes regarding the eviction of an elderly resident without due process. It was not a polite tap on the shoulder. It was a declaration of war. By Wednesday, the panic had set in. Sienna did not call me herself, of course. Instead, it was her mother, Valerie, who reached out. Her voice on the phone was smooth, devoid of the sneering tone she usually reserved for me. She invited me to dinner at the Gilded Oak, one of the most expensive steakhouses in downtown Austin, suggesting we sit down and talk like family. I knew exactly what that meant. They wanted to bury the body before the smell attracted the neighbors. I arrived wearing my best church dress, feeling out of place amidst the dark mahogany walls and the clinking of crystal glasses. The maitre d' led me to a private room in the back. Valerie sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court, with Sienna and Aaron flanking her. Aaron looked pale, staring intently at the breadbasket as if it held the secrets to the universe. Valerie did not waste time with pleasantries. She waited until the waiter had poured the wine and closed the door. Then, she reached into her designer purse and slid a check across the starched white tablecloth. It was written for $80,000. "Consider this a thank you gift for helping the children get their start," Valerie said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "We want you to be comfortable. Eleanor, all we need is for you to sign a simple document clarifying that your contribution was a one-time gift, not an investment, and that you are voluntarily relinquishing your residency rights to move somewhere more suitable for your age." Sienna leaned forward, her hand fluttering near mine. "Mom," she said, her voice trembling with a sweetness that felt chemically manufactured. "We are so sorry about the other day. It was just the stress of the party. The house was a mess, and we just snapped. We never meant to hurt you. We just want everyone to be happy." I looked at Aaron. He was spinning his wine glass by the stem, refusing to look at me. He was letting his mother-in-law buy his own mother out of his life. I looked down at the check. $80,000. To them, it was a solution. To me, it was an insult. I thought about Frank's hands, permanently stained with grease and scarred from decades of fixing other people's mistakes. I thought about my own back, aching after 12-hour shifts, standing on concrete floors, cleaning up blood and vomit so we could save enough to buy that garage. They were trying to buy my life's work for the price of a luxury car. I picked up the check. I felt the texture of the expensive paper between my thumb and forefinger. Slowly, deliberately, I tore it down the middle. The sound was sharp in the quiet room. I put the two halves together and tore them again, and again, until the check was nothing but confetti. I dropped the pieces onto my bread plate. I cannot sell 35 years of being a wife and the rest of my life being a mother for a fixed price on a piece of paper, I said, my voice steady and calm. Sienna's mask cracked. She slammed her hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "You are ruining everything," she hissed. "We have investors watching us. We have a reputation. Why do you have to be so selfish?" Valerie raised a hand to silence her daughter, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Listen to me, Eleanor. If you decide to play lawyer games with us, you need to understand who you are fighting. We have connections in this city. We have friends in the press. If you push this, we will make sure you are painted as a senile, greedy old woman. You will be embarrassed to show your face at the grocery store. You will disappear from every social circle that matters." I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I looked Valerie dead in the eye. "Mrs. Lowell," I said. "I spent 35 years working in an emergency room. I have held the hands of dying men at 3 o'clock in the morning while their families slept. I have wiped up bodily fluids and seen things that would make you faint. Do you really think I am afraid of not being invited to your cocktail parties?" I did not wait for an answer. I turned and walked out of the private room, past the stunned silence of the diners in the main hall, and out into the humid Austin night. The neon sign of the restaurant buzzed overhead, casting a red glow on the pavement. I reached into my purse and touched the folded copy of the legal strategy Colton had drafted. There was no going back now. I had burned the bridge, and for the first time in my life, I was not looking for a way to rebuild it. I was looking for the path forward. Colton Harrington's office was a world away from the grease-stained floor of Frank's garage or the sterile white tiles of the emergency room. It was located on the top floor of a glass tower, a space of minimalist furniture and breathtaking views of the Austin skyline. I sat at a long mahogany conference table, flanked by a young paralegal named Sarah and a forensic accountant who had spent the last 2 weeks dissecting the financial entrails of Lowell Wade Development. They had been thorough. The accountant, a sharp man with no patience for small talk, laid out the reality of my son's business. It was not the unstoppable empire Sienna liked to pretend it was. They were leveraged to the hilt. They had bet everything on a new mega project called Sunrise Junction, a sprawling residential complex that promised to redefine luxury living. But to break ground, they needed a massive construction loan from the bank. And that loan came with a strict covenant. The borrower could not be involved in any active litigation, especially nothing involving fraud, misappropriation of funds, or elder abuse. Colton leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. He looked at me with that intense, grey gaze. We have them. Eleanor. We have 2 options. Option A is the nuclear route. We file the lawsuit tomorrow morning. We report them to Adult Protective Services. The bank pulls the loan immediately. The project collapses, and they likely go bankrupt. It would be public, messy, and it would destroy them. I looked out the window at the ants crawling on the streets below. I thought about Aaron. I thought about the little boy who used to cry when he scraped his knee. Did I want to ruin him? No. But I could not let him stay the man he had become. Colton continued. Option B is a settlement. We approach them quietly but carrying a big stick. We force them to the table. We demand everything you are owed, plus damages. We keep it out of the courts, so the loan survives, but only if they agree to our terms. I turned back to him. I choose option B, I said. But it is not just about the money. If they want to keep their reputation, they are going to have to buy it back with more than just a check. I want my equity paid out at current market value. I want them to pay for a new apartment of my choosing, fully furnished. And I want one more thing. Colton raised an eyebrow. Name it. I want them to establish a permanent charitable fund, the Frank Wade Housing Support Fund. It will provide rental assistance for low-income seniors in Travis County. And I want it funded with a percentage of the profits from Sunrise Junction. When Colton presented these terms to the legal team representing Lowell Wade, the reaction was explosive. I was not in the room. But Colton told me their lead counsel screamed that it was legalized extortion. They threatened to countersue for defamation. They threatened to drag my name through the mud. Colton simply waited for them to finish and then read them the Texas statute on financial elder abuse, reminding them that in a civil trial, a jury would not look kindly on a wealthy couple throwing a widow out on the street. The line went dead, but the silence that followed was a victory. The fallout reached me that evening in the form of a text message from Aaron. It was a long, rambling paragraph that vibrated with panic. He told me Sienna was hysterical. He told me I was being unreasonable. He begged me to stop listening to that shark of a lawyer and just talk to him. He said, "Mum, please, do not ruin our dream. We have worked so hard for this." I sat on the edge of Daisy's guest bed, reading his words. I could imagine the scene in their house. I could imagine Sienna screaming that this was all his fault. And for the first time, Aaron probably yelling back that none of this would have happened if she had just let me stay. The cracks in their perfect facade were starting to show. I typed my reply slowly. A dream that is built on trampling other people is just a lie. Aaron, it will crack eventually. I am just helping you see the foundation before the whole house falls down. The next morning, Colton called me. His voice was grim but satisfied. They want to meet Eleanor. But they are trying to play a power game. They do not want to meet in a private office. They have invited us to the Future of the City Gala this weekend. They are the headline sponsors. I understood immediately. They wanted me on their turf, surrounded by their friends, their investors, and the press. They thought I would be too intimidated to make a scene in a ballroom full of tuxedos and gowns. They thought the Eleanor who was ashamed of her old cardigan would show up and fold. They did not realize that woman had been left on the driveway with her suitcase. The woman walking into that gala was someone entirely different. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel was a kaleidoscope of shifting lights, expensive silk, and the murmur of deal-making disguised as polite conversation. I walked onto the red carpet wearing a deep emerald gown that Daisy had spent 3 nights tailoring to fit my frame perfectly. It was simple, devoid of the sequins and feathers that adorned the younger women. But as I took Colton's arm, I felt a spine of steel running through me. A few photographers lowered their cameras, confused by the older woman in the vintage dress walking alongside one of the city's most notorious litigators. But then, the shutters began to click. They sensed a story, even if they did not know what it was yet. We navigated through the crowd toward the VIP section near the stage. I saw them immediately. Valerie, Sienna, and Aaron were seated at the center table, the one reserved for the platinum sponsors of the Sunrise Junction project. They looked like a portrait of success that was slowly melting under heat. Aaron was pale. His tie loosened slightly. Sienna was smiling too wide, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an exit. When Valerie saw me, her glass of champagne halted halfway to her mouth. Before the appetizers were served, a man in a sharp black suit approached our table. It was the opposing counsel. He whispered something to Colton, and we were ushered into a small, soundproof conference room just off the main hallway. Inside, the air was stale and tense. A representative from the bank, a man named Mr. Henderson, who controlled the financing for the entire development, was already seated, checking his watch with impatience. Valerie's lawyer cleared his throat and pushed a folder across the table. "We are prepared to increase the settlement offer to $150,000, he said, his voice low. But in exchange, we remove the requirement for the charitable fund and absolutely no public apology. We will issue a joint press release stating it was a misunderstanding." Colton did not even look at the folder. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document titled the Ethical Housing Initiative Agreement. He laid it flat on the table. "The terms remain unchanged," Colton said, his voice filling the small room. "Tonight, Mrs. Lowell will make a public apology to Eleanor from the stage. You will establish the Frank Wade Housing Support Fund immediately, and you will commit to designating 20% of the units in Sunrise Junction as affordable housing for low-income seniors, overseen by an independent board." Valerie, who had followed us in, slammed her hand on the table. "This is insane. I cannot go out there and humiliate myself in front of the mayor. I will not do it." Mr. Henderson, the banker, looked up from his phone. He did not look at Valerie with sympathy. He looked at her like she was a liability on a spreadsheet. "Mrs. Lowell," he said, his tone clinically cold. "If this agreement is not signed, and this cloud of potential litigation is not cleared by the time the main course is served, the bank will be forced to pause the underwriting process for the construction loan due to reputational risk. We cannot finance a project led by a board accused of financial elder abuse. It is your choice." Valerie turned to me, her eyes wet with rage and desperation. "Please, Eleanor, we can apologize privately. We can do it in the office. Do not make me do this in front of everyone. I looked at the woman who had laughed while I was seated behind a potted plant. I looked at the woman who had called me a bad brand image. My humiliation was not private, Valerie, I said softly. It happened in broad daylight, in front of my neighbors, on the driveway of a house I helped pay for. You threw me out for the world to see. Now you can apologize while the world is watching. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Finally, Valerie snatched the pen from her lawyer's hand. She signed the document with a jagged, angry scrawl. 10 minutes later, we were back in the ballroom. The house lights dimmed. The master of ceremonies, a local news anchor with perfect teeth, stepped up to the microphone. He announced that before the main presentation, there would be a special moment regarding the ethical commitment of the Sunrise Junction project. The spotlight swung through the darkness and landed on Valerie. She stood up. From a distance, she looked elegant, but I was close enough to see the way the paper in her hand was trembling. She walked up the stairs to the stage, her heels clicking a rhythm of defeat. The room went quiet. Valerie adjusted the microphone stand. She looked out at the sea of faces, the investors, the politicians, the socialites she had spent a lifetime trying to impress. She cleared her throat, but her voice cracked on the first syllable. I would like to take a moment to address a serious failing in our family and our company, she read, the words sounding forced and dry. In our pursuit of progress, we lost sight of the values that build a true community. Specifically, I want to apologize to Mrs. Eleanor Wade. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. People whispered. I sat in the front row, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my back straight against the chair. I did not look down. I did not shrink. For the first time in years, I was not the invisible woman in the corner. I was the reason the room had stopped breathing. Valerie's voice wavered as she reached the crucial sentence of the statement we had drafted. We were wrong to use our wealth to mask how we treated the most vulnerable members of our own family, she read, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Around the ballroom, I saw phones rise in unison, glowing screens capturing the moment. The cameras zoomed in, not just on Valerie, but on the table where my family sat. Sienna's face was flushed a deep, blotchy red, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if she wished to dissolve into the weave. Beside her, Aaron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in a throat that looked too tight for his collar. He looked terrified, but for the first time, the fear was not about money. It was about shame. The master of ceremonies stepped back to the microphone as Valerie retreated, looking defeated. He looked at me in the front row and asked if Mrs. Wade would like to say a few words. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anxiety, but my body moved with a calmness that surprised me. I stood up. I could hear the click of my low heels on the wooden steps leading to the stage. It was a sound I would remember for the rest of my life, the sound of walking toward my own voice. I stood before the microphone. The lights were blinding, turning the audience into a sea of silhouettes. I did not tell them about the suitcase on the driveway or the broken picture frame. I simply said that for a long time. I thought silence was the price of keeping a family together. I told them I thought that if I made myself small enough, I would not be a burden. But I realized that my silence only taught people that I could be displaced whenever it was convenient. I looked directly at where I knew Aaron was sitting. I said that I did not use the law to seek revenge. I used it to remind everyone, including myself, that self-respect has no expiration date. In the hush that followed, I saw Aaron wipe his eyes. It was not the polite dabbing of a man moved by a speech. It was the messy, unguarded gesture of a boy realizing he had underestimated the woman who raised him. He was crying because he realized I was standing tall without leaning on him, and perhaps that made him see just how much he had been leaning on everyone else. By the next morning, the story had shifted. The local papers ran headlines about the Ethical Housing Initiative and the launch of the Frank Wade Housing Support Fund. There was a photo of me on the second page, shaking hands with the director of a non-profit. I was not bowing my head in gratitude. I was looking him in the eye as a partner. The caption did not call me a victim. It called me a founder. 3 days later, a knock came at Daisy's front door. I opened it to find Aaron standing on the porch. He was alone. His suit, usually pressed to perfection, was wrinkled at the elbows, and he looked like he had not slept in 48 hours. He asked if he could come in. He did not ask for water or coffee. He just followed me into Daisy's small living room, which smelled faintly of cinnamon and baked apples. He sat on the floral sofa, looking oversized and out of place among the knickknacks. For a long time, he just stared at his hands. Then, the dam broke. He told me he had been terrified of losing his place in the Lowell family. He admitted that he felt like an imposter in their world, always afraid that if he did not laugh at their jokes or agree with their cruelty, they would realize he was just a mechanic's son from the South Side. He looked up at me, his eyes red. "Mom, watching you on that stage, I felt like a child hiding behind someone's skirt. I let them treat you like dirt because I was too scared to stand in the wind." It hurt to hear him say it, but it was a clean hurt, like setting a broken bone. I felt a wave of love for him, but I did not let it wash away the boundary I had built. I did not hug him and tell him it was okay. It was not okay. I told him that I was not going to withdraw the agreement. I told him I was not sorry for what I did. I said that if he wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, he had to do it with actions, not just tearful apologies in a quiet room. I reached into the folder on the coffee table and pulled out a copy of the charter for the new housing fund. I handed it to him. "If you want to make this right, and if you want to honor your father, you make sure this fund is real," I said. "Do not let them turn this into a cheap public relations stunt. You run this properly. Aaron, you make sure people get homes. That is the only way back." He took the paper. His hands were steadying. He nodded. Not as a son obeying a mother, but as a man accepting a challenge. It was a narrow road I had offered him, but for the first time in years, it was a road that led somewhere real. My days filled up with a new kind of urgency. I started attending meetings with the non-profit housing organization, sitting in conference rooms with architects and social workers who were half my age. At first, I stayed quiet, scribbling notes on a yellow pad. But then the conversation turned to the practicalities of eviction and health. I found myself speaking up, telling them about the patients I had seen in the emergency room, elderly men and women who ended up in hospital beds simply because they had been put out on the street and forgot to take their blood pressure medication. I told them that housing was not just about walls and a roof. It was about dignity and continuity of care. When I finished speaking, the room was silent, and the young project manager nodded with a seriousness that told me I was finally being heard. 6 months after the gala. We broke ground on the first building. I stood in the Texas heat, wearing a hard hat that felt strange over my hair, watching 2 workers hoist a temporary sign into place. It read, Frank Wade Senior Housing, in partnership with the Wade family and Lowell Wade Development. Seeing Frank's name in bold blue letters made my throat tighten. He had spent his life fixing things that were broken, usually under the hood of a car. Now, his name was going to help fix lives that had been broken by the system. Colton stood beside me, wiping sweat from his forehead. He turned to me and asked if I would officially join the advisory board of the Ethical Housing Initiative. I laughed, a dry, self-deprecating sound, and told him I was just a retired nurse who knew how to start an IV, not a policymaker. Colton looked at the sign and then back at me. He told me that the board had enough lawyers and money men. He said they needed someone who knew what it felt like to be disposable. I agreed to do it. On the personal front, things were shifting too, though slower. Aaron started coming by Daisy's house every Sunday. He stopped wearing his expensive Italian suits and started showing up in jeans and t-shirts. He did not bring extravagant gifts to buy my affection anymore. Instead, he brought bags of groceries, toilet paper, and once, a box of the peppermint tea I liked. We sat in the kitchen and talked. He told me he was untangling his finances from Sienna's family, setting up his own savings accounts for the first time in years. He admitted he was terrified of standing on his own, but he looked more like the son I raised than he had in a decade. The emails from Sienna started arriving late at night. They were long, rambling blocks of text. She wrote about growing up in a house where appearances mattered more than affection, where her mother would inspect her outfits before letting her leave her room. She explained how terrified she was of failing to maintain the image she had been trained to project. She did not ask for forgiveness, and she did not justify what she did to me. She just wanted me to know why she was broken. I read every word, sometimes twice, but I did not reply. Understanding her pain was one thing, inviting it back into my life was another. I gave myself the grace of not being ready yet. The real turning point came when we opened the common room of the first completed unit. It was a bright, airy space with comfortable chairs and a small library. An 80-year-old woman named Margaret, who had been living in her car for 3 months, walked up to me. She took my hand in hers, her skin paper-thin and warm. She thanked me. She said that because I made a fuss. People were finally listening to the old folks. In that moment, I realized that the humiliation of having my bags thrown on the driveway had been recycled. It had been composted into something that could grow hope. Colton and I fell into a rhythm of our own. We went to dinner once or twice a week, usually to quiet places where we could talk. We discussed the cases he had won and the ones that haunted him. We talked about why he never married. He told me he had come close once, years ago, but realized he was looking for a ghost of a girl he met in college. We did not label what we were doing. It was a companionship that did not need definition, just a comfortable silence and the shared knowledge of a long history. One afternoon, Colton took me to the top of his office building. He showed me a rendering of a new rooftop garden they were planning for the community center downtown. He pointed to a secluded area with comfortable benches and a view of the hills. He said he wanted to call it Eleanor's Corner. I laughed and told him he was sentimental, but I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. I walked to the edge of the roof and looked out over the city. In the distance, past the highway, I could just make out the hazy green outline of the suburb where Aaron and Sienna lived. For the first time, looking at that direction did not make my stomach turn. I realized I had not been pushed out of that life. I had stepped out of it. I had walked out of a small, suffocating box and into a world that was wide, messy, and entirely my own. I was not looking back anymore. I was looking at the horizon. One evening, while a light rain tapped against the window pane, my phone buzzed with a message from Sienna. It was short and desperate. She wanted to meet alone, without her mother or Aaron. She said she needed to speak to me, woman to woman. She sent the address of a small coffee shop on the east side of the city, far away from the country clubs and high-end boutiques she usually frequented. When I arrived, Sienna was already sitting at a corner table. She looked nothing like the polished socialite who had thrown my suitcase down the driveway. She was wearing a denim jacket over a plain t-shirt, and her face was bare of makeup. She looked exhausted. She admitted that ever since the gala, the silence from their friends had been deafening. Partners were whispering behind their backs. Her mother was in a constant state of rage, and the company was stretched to its breaking point. She told me she never imagined the consequences would be this heavy. At first, she tried to retreat into the role of the victim. She talked about how Valerie had always controlled her, how she felt pressured to be cold to me, to maintain the standard of luxury her mother demanded. But as I sat there silently, stirring my coffee, she stopped. She looked down at her hands and finally said the truth. She admitted that she had chosen the easy path. She had chosen to stand with the strong and pour all her frustrations onto me because she thought I would never fight back. Then came the ask. She reached across the table and begged me to speak to Colton. She wanted us to soften the terms of the charitable fund, to reduce the percentage of profits they had to contribute so the company could breathe a little easier. She promised that if I did this, we could go back to being a real family. I took a sip of my coffee and set the cup down gently. I explained to her that the agreement was not a noose I was using to choke them. It was a fence. It was a boundary built to ensure that people like Valerie, and even Sienna herself, could not easily push vulnerable people out into the cold when things got difficult. I told her that I could not tear down that fence just because they were feeling crowded by the consequences of their own actions. Sienna started to cry. She asked if I would ever forgive her. I told her that forgiveness was not something legal. I told her to show me how she treated people in 5 or 10 years. That was when I would know if I could forgive her, and I might not even need to say the words aloud. While I was driving back to Daisy's house, Colton called me. He had just gotten off the phone with the bank representative. It turned out that the Ethical Housing Initiative and the Frank Wade Fund were the deciding factors. The bank approved the loan for Sunrise Junction specifically because the community commitment reduced their reputational risk. The irony was perfect. My son and his wife were saved. But they were saved by the very thing I had forced them to build. They would have to spend the next 20 years maintaining affordable housing to keep their fortune. My revenge was not destruction. It was forcing them to live within a system of kindness. That night, I packed the last of my boxes in Daisy's guest room. I was moving into my own apartment the next morning. A modest place with big windows near the city centre, paid for with my settlement. I stood in front of the mirror, buttoning a thick wool coat. Colton was waiting outside in his truck. We were going on a long road trip out west, something we had talked about when we were 20 and were finally doing at nearly 70. My phone chimed with a text from Aaron. He said that he and Sienna wanted to come over and help me clean the new apartment, if I would allow it. I typed back a simple reply. I told him the door was always open, but they had to walk through it as adults, not as people giving orders. I turned off my phone and smiled. I picked up my bag and walked out the door. This time, nobody was throwing me out. I was leaving on my own terms. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on how I handled things. If you enjoyed this diary entry, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like the video, and hit that hype button so we can share these stories with even more people.